Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Please consider subscribing and check out our Patreon for more. Enjoy the video. It was a warm, friendly room, and Robert turned around to look at everything. Molly had gone into the bathroom in the suite, and the sounds of a bath could be heard in the room. Robert got into the bath and was surprised that the water smelled good and had bubbles in it. Julia Stevens was deep in thought as she sat in her armchair in the library downstairs. Her thoughts were all over the place. How could her desire for revenge change into a mother's love for a sad child? She wondered if she was going to be one of those women who couldn't have kids. As she sat and looked into space, she didn't know how she felt. As the grandmother's clock ticked off the seconds, time crept along. Molly came in and curtsied to her miss. "Okay, Molly? Ma'am, what's the dress code for dinner?" "Formal Molly, please tell our guest, and also ask our guest if they would like to use the clothes in the closets. If they say no, wait until their clothes are clean before having dinner." "Yes, ma'am." As she left the library, Molly curtsied again. Julia looked at the fire again, and as she thought about her problem, her thoughts were all over the place. Even though it was clear that a girl was waiting to get out of the young man, would helping the child get away be the right thing to do? She thought more about herself and tried to figure out what drove her. She took a deep breath, leaned back in the armchair, and put the file back in her hands. She looked at the numbers on the paper. Her stores were doing well, and she wondered if she could use some of her stocks to make a lot of money by betting against other stocks. As she sat there with the papers on her lap, she could feel her feelings for the boy-girl upstairs growing stronger. After an hour, Molly walked back into the library with a smile and gave her boss a deep curtsy. If her smile could have gotten any bigger, it did, and she looked like she was about to burst with news. As she stood there, someone knocked on the library door, which opened slowly. When Julia looked up, her face showed that she was very shocked. Robert was in the doorway, but it wasn't Robert. His hair was brushed back. He curtsied, but it was a little awkward, and she had to try not to laugh at the attempt. "Good morning, Miss Stevens. Do you think this is dressy enough for dinner?" He did so. When Julia nodded, the boy's face lit up, and he seemed to blush because he didn't say anything. This made Julia even more confused, because everything that was happening was girly, and the boy was wearing a party dress. Julia slowly got up, walked to the doorway, and looked at the dress for flaws. "Ma'am, dinner is ready, and the young miss can join us if she wants to." Molly broke the silence with her words. Julia showed the way to the dining room. When she got there, she saw that there were two places set. Hers was at the head of the table, as usual, and the other was to the left. A bottle of wine was next to her glass, and a small jug of black currant juice was next to a water glass. Molly pushed Robert's chair back and led him to the second place. After Julia sat down, Molly put the young man who had been made to look like a woman in the seat that was meant for him/her. She filled Robert's water glass with cordial and then filled her mistress's glass with wine. Then dinner was served. Julia's was her usual gourmet food, and the other was from a menu for a school. Robert was happy for the first time since he left care. He didn't care that he looked silly in his clothes. He liked the way the dress felt, so he asked Miss Julia to call him Roberta. Miss Julia said she would do it, which made him smile. The way he was dressed and the way he was treated seemed to make him whole. When they got to the dessert course, Molly gave him a small bowl of ice cream, which he ate with gusto. Julia skipped dessert in favor of a cup of coffee. She watched as the small bowl of ice cream was eaten and thought about what she would ask Roberta. When the meal was finally over, the two of them went to a living room to watch TV. Julia was worried about what she was going to ask the man who had been turned into a woman. Then she remembered her values. As a white witch, she could only use her magic to help the person she was trying to help. If what she was going to ask was wrong, the spell wouldn't work. This let her relax while she watched a TV drama. She reached for a small, thin wooden box that had a thin, straight white rowan branch tucked inside. Someone knocked. "Ma'am, this is Roberta." "Hey, Roberta, can I ask you something?" Yes, ma'am. Molly made you wear the dress to please me, right? No, ma'am. Molly offered to clean my clothes, but when I saw all the pretty clothes in the closets, I wanted to look pretty. When I was little, my friends and I also played house and dressed up, but we never had a dress as pretty as this one. The young man's face lit up as he thought about good times. So, Roberta, if you could always be Roberta, you'd want to be her? Ma'am, I guess you think I'm sick. The look changed into one of sadness. Roberta, I was going to punish you for breaking the window of one of my shops, but now I don't want to. I want to give you what you want, but I also want to have a daughter. For me, would you be that daughter? Ma'am? The answer was, can I call you Mommy? In a girlish way. Yes, Roberta, you may. Julia took the rowan wand and tapped it on her palm. She then told Roberta to go to the library and get an old book. She ran off to get the book, almost skipping, and Julia watched as the sounds of childish joy echoed from the hallway. Roberta ran back into the living room, carrying the volume. She put the book on the woman's lap and sat on the floor to wait for the woman to talk. She watched as Julia turned the old pages and looked through them to find a certain spell. She found it, took the page out of the book, and slowly looked at it. Then she lifted the rowan wand and stood over Roberta. Salamorda, invincible, Julia sang out. As she spoke, a white light flowed from the wand and surrounded the person sitting on the floor. The light pulsed with life, and as it went out, it got stronger and then weaker. A voice joined the light, and with each pulse of the light, it seemed to get louder and quieter. The face in the middle of the light started to soften and look younger. It then became rounder and more like a child's. The body shrank and softened, and a layer of baby fat covered it. Sensations started to move through the face, making it look worried. The clothes fell, and it stood up a little bit unsteadily. There was a pink mist, but changes could be seen happening. Julia watched the changes happen and was glad that the person who got the spell didn't feel any pain. The light went out, and where there had been a boy's body, there was now a girl. The next morning, Roberta woke up and looked around the room, not quite sure where she was. As she turned her head, she saw a big, blonde teddy bear. It was huge, and when she reached out to touch it, she looked at her hand twice. She looked at the fat arm and thought, my God, I must still be asleep and dreaming. She knew it was a girl's hand, but what confused her was that when the hand moved, she felt things from her past. She laid there for what seemed like an eternity, moving her hand in and out of her line of sight. She could feel a hand touch the soft pink blanket she was wrapped in, and she could see bars that were just high enough to keep her from falling out of bed. As soon as she realized how she was thinking, her mind began to spin. Mama, Mama! She heard a voice that sounded like a kid crying out, and it took her a few seconds to realize that it was her voice. After she screamed, a woman's face with a soft smile appeared in the doorway. Roberta saw Mommy Julia walking to the little bed, and she smiled as she did so. Julia walked over to where her new daughter was lying under the blanket. She looked down at the little girl and then reached down. The sound of giggles filled the room, and Julia found herself laughing along with her daughter. Molly walked in looking a little messy. She looked at her mistress and her new daughter and thought about all the things she had to do and how she would find time to help care for the new girl. She sighed and ran a bath for her boss to wash the child in. Then she went back to her room to put on her uniform for the day. As she was leaving the room, she heard Julia tell her to dress casually for the day because they were going shopping after breaking their fast. She rolled her eyes. The night before, Julia had called her from the shop to say she was bringing in a young man who had broken something on her property. She had thought that her boss would make the young man act like a woman for a few days. But things took a strange turn, and it turned out that the young man had always wanted to be a girl. Even though she was told to dress down, she always made sure she looked nice so she wouldn't make her boss look bad. She walked back to the room after getting dressed in a deep purple business suit and a blouse. Julia was putting training pants on the girl who was having trouble. On the dresser were pants with frills and a pretty party dress. Roberta started to think about what had happened to her, and she smiled. Finally, her biggest wish came true, and she was a happy girl with a mom who loved her. She didn't know much about Molly's, Mommy's maid, so she stared at her with big hazel eyes and long, soft eyelashes. As she watched the maid, she put her thumb back to her mouth and wondered if this girl would be a friend or just someone who helped Mommy. Molly could almost feel how strong the girl's thoughts were, and she thought about how she felt about the new daughter. She thought it was hard, and she realized that most of what she didn't like about it was that having an extra person meant more work. As Julia stood there thinking, she watched the other two people in the house exchange looks. She thought about what this would mean for her maid. She decided very quickly and gave her maid a smile. "Molly, I've made up my mind. I'm going to be a stay-at-home mom," she smiled. "Really, ma'am?" "Yes, that means it's up to me to take care of Roberta." After that, the three of them went back to the kitchen where the cook had made breakfast. Roberta had oatmeal, and the two women had a continental breakfast. They talked about what they were going to do, and Roberta listened as the adults talked about going shopping. They walked out to the car and put Roberta in a child's seat in the back of the 4x4. They started moving toward the town so they could go shopping. Roberta hugged the rag doll and told herself she would be the best daughter in the world. As Robert, she sighed as she thought about her past and the mistakes she had made. She had made a lot of mistakes in her life, just like Robert did when he followed the crowd and got in trouble. Sometimes you need a different point of view to see the right picture. She smiled as she imagined a new life with pretty dresses, ballet, and maybe even a pony someday. She closed her eyes and let Robert drift away. Her face turned into a smile as she settled down for a nap. Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out Patreon for a lot more content and early access to YouTube videos.